Good evening. Really? Seriously? Y'all gonna do me like that? Good evening. Thank you. It's good to be here in person. I'm very happy to see that we're able to begin to regain some of the dynamism of this place. One of the first impressions I had when I came to the journalism school was just how it was a hive of activity and exchange and intellectual exchange, and these sorts of events were happening all the time. So I'm really happy to see that we're getting back to that. Although that's counterbalanced by the sadness that we have to have this particular conversation. And as I was thinking about this film and this dialogue, it occurred to me that one of the things that I'm always pushing is the importance of contextualizing reporting. That we have to have a sense of what came before what we're covering now. And one of the first things I thought about was the fact that on October 12th, 1958, the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation in Atlanta was bombed. A bomb went off in the building. It was unattributed, was an act of terrorism. It was later discovered that it was an act committed by a set of local Atlantans who were disgruntled and angry at the congregation for its involvement in support of the civil rights movement. The editor, Ralph McGill, the editor-in-chief of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, wrote an editorial about it that ultimately wound up winning a Pulitzer Prize, condemning the violence that had been visited upon the city. But it was an important touch point because of the toxic stew of racism and anti-Semitism that had been welded into a terrible new whole, and that we've seen reiterated over time again and again at various crisis points in American society. Almost 60 years to the day later, on October 27th, just 60 years and 2 weeks later, we saw the horrific attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The echoes of history could not be more apparent, especially when we began to see the social media postings and the ecosystem of hate that contributed to the massacre taking place in the first place. And the kind of xenophobic, the confluence of xenophobia and anti-Semitism that led to the attack on this institution as a proxy for an attack on the immigrant population in the United States, or kind of scapegoating this community for saying that they had, in their refugee resettlement work, they were helping to change the complexion of the United States. And so in that community, when I was there, I was sent to cover the aftermath by the New Yorker. And in that community, I started getting a different echo, a really equally difficult echo to process. And that is from people whom I had been in touch with, people whom I'd met during the time that I covered the Charleston shooting, the shooting at Emmanuel AME Church that happened in June of 2015. The better part of this was that many of those people who, if they knew that I was in Pittsburgh, began contacting me to say that they were en route to Pittsburgh, or that they had other people in the survivors community in Charleston who were going to Pittsburgh. And so this vitriolic hate was being countered by a very conscientious and calibrated benevolence, an attempt to counterbalance this toxin that we had seen let loose in our collective bloodstream. That's the context for this film, and I wish that I could say that we were examining a subject that were, academic in its import. But the fact of it is that it is not. This subject matter is unfortunately relevant, and with the tide of current events, as we see just even in the last few days, I don't even know what the appropriate adjective is, but the shuttling of migrants from Texas to Martha's Vineyard, as if you were merely taking out the trash. The level of inhumanity that we have as a baseline is something that should concern all of us. And so I hope that this film and the dialogue, the clip that you'll see in the dialogue that ensues, will help us get to at least a better place of enlightenment in this for and the conversation, which will be led by our faculty member, Nina Berman, may be particularly useful for our students here who I hope never have to cover these sort of events, but may well have to cover these sorts of events. And so with that, I will wrap it up and leave it to the film and the conversation to take place. And thank you all for coming out. We are really very happy to have you here with us this evening.
I didn't hear the shots the first time. I hear them all the time now. And I suspect I'm not alone. So many of us, whether Jewish or not, whether from Squirrel Hill or not, whether in Pittsburgh that morning or not, hear those shots still. They were the modern-day shots heard around the world. The opening shots in our contemporary crisis of hurt and hate.
Suspects talking about all these Jews need to die.
I become frustrated about what I can do as an elected leader in a city that has now witnessed the worst anti-Semitic attack in American history.
It's not just about anti-Semitism. It was an attack on America. Its foundation is hate.
White supremacy, white nationalism, and racism are national security threats.
The story of what's happened in Pittsburgh starts with some of the worst pain that you can imagine. And it ends with some of the best and closest relationships that I could have ever hoped for.
We will work together as one. We will defeat hate with love. We will be a city of compassion, welcoming to all people, no matter what your religion or where your family came from on this earth or your status.
The Torah is referred to as a tree of life. It's the source of who we are as Jews. "11 beautiful lives were cut down in our synagogue. But we're a tree of life. More leaves will grow back. More branches will grow back. We're not letting hate close our doors, ever."
Can I invite my guests up? Thank you. Yeah. So this is just a 20-minute clip of a longer film. I want to introduce first Patrice O'Neill, who is a filmmaker and CEO of the Oakland-based nonprofit strategic media company, The Working Group, and founder of Not in Our Town, a movement of people across the country working to build safe, inclusive communities for all. Patrice is co-director of United Against Hate Week, which is in November, right? A civic action program launched by Bay Area city and civic leaders, educators, and activists to raise awareness and spark action to stop hate and bias. Next to Patrice is Charene Zalis, who produces and directs films for The Working Group and the PBS film program Not in Our Town. Her films focus on human rights issues, standing up to hate, and people who are making change in their communities. Prior to joining The Working Group, Zalis produced for the Global Vision human rights series Rights and Wrongs, where she reported stories from the US, the Middle East, and Asia, and produced for the Frontline documentary The Arming of Saudi Arabia on PBS. Zalis began her career at NBC News and Sports, and easier beat, right? Where she won an Emmy Award for The Championship, a documentary on Muhammad Ali. And over to my right is Tess Owen. She is senior reporter at Vice News. She covers extremism and hate crimes and the dissident right. She's a two-time winner of the Newswoman Award for Investigative Reporting. She joined Vice as a reporter after completing her master's here at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and she was named a senior reporter in 2021. I'm Professor Nina Berman, and I teach photography here and have covered right-wing extremist movements since, I guess, I started my career in the late 80s, early 90s. So I'd want to first talk with Charene and Patrice. We can start off with some basic questions. And how did you begin to tell this story, and why did you think this was an important story to tell?
Well, thanks so much, Nina, and to everyone, Dolores and Jelani, for inviting us here in Columbia. We're so happy to be here, especially to speak to the young journalists who are in the room. Our story started many decades ago when we did a film about people in Billings, Montana, who were standing up to hate crimes. At that time, a then resurgent white power movement was organizing in the Northwest. They started attacking people in Billings, trying to lay claim to that town. And there were people in the community who started saying, we better do something, including the police chief, who said to the town, I can't do this on my own, silence is acceptance. So when a black church had skinheads show up to intimidate the congregation, members of other denominations showed up, and the skinheads went away. When a Native American woman's home was plastered with racist graffiti, 30 members of the Painters Union were there to paint it over, and 100 neighbors showed up to cheer them on. The culminating event took place when a six-year-old Jewish boy placed a menorah in his window for Hanukkah. A brick is thrown through the window and it landed on his bed, and people said, this is really getting more dangerous. What if we're all Jewish? And so the newspaper printed a full-page menorah, urging people to put it in their windows. And that year, 10,000 people put menorahs in their windows in Billings, Montana, where there are very few Jewish people. So we told that story in a PBS film called Not in Our Town, and the name came from a sporting goods store that had a sign that said, "No hate, no fear, no violence, not in our town." So that was the name of our film. We thought maybe we'd do 10 town hall meetings around the country. There were over 100, and people started using the name, Not in Our Town. And I think one of the most important decisions I made, and many of us made, all of us who were working on it at that time, is to follow the story. This was not a story about hate crimes. This was a story about a community standing up together. And it had so much power because it gave people something they could do. It was a story that showed we are so powerful if we act together. So that's the kind of stories that, I met Charene not many years later, and she became my filmmaking partner. We've done many films about this topic, including Waking Oak Creek, about the attack at the Sikh temple and the response there. So there's this building of a narrative about what communities can do. And in the process of screening those other films, Waking Oak Creek, we started seeing and hearing about this resurgent anti-Semitism. It's not like it hasn't been there, but this was different, and it was really alarming. This is about the same time that a lot of Jewish journalists are being attacked, and it was deeply disturbing, so that when Pittsburgh happened, as A.C. Thompson says, it was shocking and horrible, but it wasn't surprising. And so Charene and I decided she should go and see what's happening on the ground.
And Charene, you arrived a couple days after the event, and how did you know that this was a place that you wanted to really focus on, that this was going to be a story? Like, what were some of the first things that you saw that you knew that this was the place to be for you?
It was the first day when we arrived, actually. It was about 5 days after the attack, and I met Brian Dentz, our DP, out of New York at the airport, and we hadn't set up anything. We had no contacts, we had no plan. So we went straight to Tree of Life, and what we saw there was a community grieving. There were so many people from across Pittsburgh leaving flowers, lighting candles, embracing each other. And the mainstream media had kind of left at this point. 5 days was enough. So people started coming over to us, "Oh, who are you with?" And we started talking to them and just asking very simple questions. Why are you here? Why is it important to be here? What message do you want the world to know about what happened in Pittsburgh? And, the responses that we got from people was that this was an attack on the Jewish community, of course, but all of Pittsburgh is feeling the pain right now. And we moved from there. It was the last funeral for the 97-year-old, the oldest victim, Rose Mallinger. And the lines around the synagogue were just enormous. And I went and spoke to people, "Are you waiting to get in?" And they're like, "Oh no, we didn't know Rose. We just came here to pay our respects." And the rabbi, would always say later when I interviewed him, "How do you gun down a 97-year-old woman? She used to lead the prayer for peace in the synagogue every Saturday." And from there, Friday night, this all happened in one day, there was a call for people across Pittsburgh, Jewish, not Jewish, atheist, whatever, to come and re-enter the synagogue because people were afraid that people would not want to go back after such a horrific attack. And I saw the editor of the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, and he was standing by the metal detectors. The place was covered with security, police cars everywhere, and 1,000 people were lined up to enter. And they said, "We're not going to let these haters shut us down. We're not going to make them afraid of who we are." And you could just feel the solidarity, and it was so powerful. And it was that night, which we can talk about later, inside the synagogue, Wasi Muhammad, who you meet in the film, was the executive director of the Islamic Center. He was asked to speak that night. And when he went up to the podium, he got a standing ovation. And I was thinking, what is going on here? This is so powerful. And Patrice and I decided, okay, this seems like a town who wants to acknowledge that there's a problem. It's not like this is an isolated incident. This guy came from somewhere else. Everybody in Pittsburgh is doing fine. It was a town that people who were living there came over to us and wanted to talk about it and said, we have to deal with this. So we decided to stay with the story.
So you have like many really fascinating characters, from the young woman who said that she thought her parents' discussions around anti-Semitism were dramatic because she grew up in this very protected bubble, to the journalists. But tell me a bit more about Wasim Muhammad, because I found him really compelling and very charismatic. And was there something in the community in Pittsburgh before this event that made this unity possible? And just tell me a bit more about him and any of the other characters that you felt were sort of central to Pittsburgh's reaction.
Do you want to?
We'll talk about Wasi, and then I'll talk about.
Okay, well, I can say that the first time I interviewed Wasi in the Botanical Gardens, it was after that Friday night. I was like, I need to talk to this guy. And I met him on Sunday. And I remember he was saying, I know the rabbi. We have a relationship. So this was different than some of the stories that we have covered, some of the films we had made, where this horrific event happens and then people don't really know each other and they're trying to figure out how they're going to connect, how they're going to work together. Wasi had been to the Tree of Life. He was invited to service there. The rabbi had been to the Islamic Center. And with all the characters in the film, we could see this was a town with deep relationships. So that was an interesting component to that they had a little bit of a head start in facing hate and trying to come up with solutions. But Wasi, when I met him, he's 26 years old. He went to the University of Pittsburgh, and the Islamic Center's right down the street. And he started just going there for prayers and for meals. And I think at 27, he was made the executive director, and he was just a powerful force in the community. And he just kept showing up. When he says we were going to go to the funerals and we were going to raise money and we were going to be there, whatever the Jewish community needed, it was true. We spent so much time in Pittsburgh, and at every event we went to, every community discussion, every meeting with students, he was there. And, you just sense his energy and his passion and his commitment. And again, he shared, he said Muslims are no stranger to this kind of hatred, and spoke very deeply about the need to unify and unite around white supremacist violence, because it doesn't only attack the Jewish people, but black people and Muslims and gay. We all know these stories. And he just was just an amazing character and person.
Do you want to add to?
I do. I just want to say that we tried to give you a 20-minute experience that sort of set up some of the context to the story and what was happening in Pittsburgh. But most of the film is really about those connections, and the connections that were forged before this happened. Really important, I think, for any city to understand the relationships that the Jewish community helped bring together, but people in Pittsburgh forged. People there, they say, we're like a small town, and I couldn't believe how many people know each other. Almost everywhere we went. But this is a story about escalating solidarity. And in this story, you see it happen over and over because people are making connections. How do we stand up to racism together and anti-Semitism? Attacks on Asian people as the pandemic occurred, on immigrants. It is an evolving story. It was an evolving story, and I think it's one of the things that, as we've done the few screenings that we had, is most inspiring to people are those connections that are built and that become sort of the center of the story.
I like that phrase you use, escalating solidarity, as a kind of dramatic device, right? That is the drama of the film, is that the solidarity keeps building and building and building and building. And normally it's kind of the opposite, like the dramatic sort of push in a film tends to be towards violence, right? Or towards tragedy. Which brings me to another question, which is, you do not name the killer in your film. It's very clear that you avoided his name. We just hear his first name, right, briefly. How did you come to that decision? Was that something that that you do in all of your films? Is it something that the community requested? How did you make that decision?
I think that's something that communities who've been targeted by hate have asked, and a lot of people who are sort of steeped in this work are saying, let's not name them. So I was just at the Eradicate Hate Summit, which I hope we can talk about more, but these people they see themselves as martyrs, and they want to be glorified. They want their name, they put their names on their weapons, okay? They try to emulate each other, they quote each other. And I think for journalists to sort of advance that, and you know, you need some basic facts. We quite often name them at one time, right? But in this case, we felt it was really important. If you want to find out their name, you'll be able to do this through news reporting. We don't need to amplify that here. And the story often is about the crime, and people want to know about the perpetrator. I don't know what it is. It's like a pattern. It's a story pattern. It's a narrative pattern. And I think what we're trying to do is disrupt that narrative with a equally complicated and vital one about the people who have agency and are trying to cope with the trauma, cope with what happened, and do something about it.
Thank you. I'd like to now give Tess Owen a chance. Tess covers the white supremacist extremist beat from the other side, the less inspiring side, I would have to say. You've been doing this since before Charlottesville 2017, and you've looked at the haters and the enablers and their funders and their platforms. How did you come to this beat, and did anything in your life prepare you for it? And what did you have to learn quickly to be able to report?
So I came to the beat, I was sort of covering civil rights, and then that sort of started turning into coverage of hate crimes when hate crimes started spiking around the 2016 election. And then from there, I started sort of looking at more of the sort of organized hatred and how also these ideas were being mainstreamed from the fringes. And so I was looking at anti-immigration groups like FAIR and how they'd sort of mainstreamed their ideology into the Trump agenda. And then there was a group that I started looking at, I think it was the spring of 2017. And, you know, in the past when I thought of white supremacists in the US, I thought of guys with Confederate flags and swastikas and all that, and or you know clan robes. And these guys were young and they were clean cut and they were preppy and they were college educated, some of them, and they had this sort of Greco-Roman aesthetic. It was very clear that they were trying to cultivate trying to recruit a certain kind of white man, and this was completely sort of shocking to me. And then, you know, however many months later, this is one of the groups, Identity Europa, that was marching in Charlottesville, chanting, you know, Jews will not replace us. And at that time, the extremism beat wasn't really a thing in most newsrooms, and there wasn't really, I'd say, like a sort of code of ethics to follow at that point. There was no sort of script, there was no sort of like how to report on this. And so many of us who were on it sort of fairly early, I'd say, were sort of making it up as we go along and trying to carve out our own code of ethics. And I mean, the thing that I think the most important overall thing I learned, which was learning how to report it, where you expose it without amplifying. And so you sort of look into how they want to seem. Do they want to look strong? Do they want to look smart? Do they want to look powerful? Do they want to look like they've got many followers? Being aware of that and then sort of kind of working against that in your reporting. Learning that, for example, it's not really always useful to be able to have the phone number of a extremist leader, you know, on speed dial, because what you're going to find out from them is not, you know, they use the media to their own advantage, to their advantage, and You'll probably find out more information about how a group operates by listening to their podcasts when they're in their own circles, or you can go into their chat rooms and see how they interact with each other. But they have become, I would say, even savvier over the years about how to use media to their own, how to exploit it for their own gain. And I think as well, and the other thing I wouldn't do is obviously quoting from their propaganda. That's something that's like a major no-no. And then also learning to, at times, sort of step back and, when you can, tell the stories about resilience. Try and tell this, sort of center the stories of survivors or of hate crimes or people who've been targeted by trolling or swatted. Telling those stories, or the people who are trying to make a real change in the space. For example, school teachers who are learning to adapt and recognize the signs of white nationalism among their students. So I think those are sort of the things that I've learned or sort of had to sort of learn quickly.
So I personally find myself a little daunted by the range of white supremacist attacks from all areas, right? And it's like, what do you focus on? The misogynists, the anti-black racists, the election deniers, there's like on and on and on and on. And so for you, on a daily basis, how do you choose what story to work on? Like, what is your day like?
It's a great question. I've learned that it's not a one-size-fits-all. You can't say, you can't really move seamlessly between different flavors of extremists. Each one comes with their, there are obvious overlaps, but each comes with their own complicated history. The way that you might approach an incel community where you're looking at the history of misogyny, or if you're looking at sort of like white supremacist militias, they have their own history. If you're talking about neo-Nazis, they have their own history, the history of anti-Semitism, of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and how that sort of figures, how they all have their own histories. So I think it is hard to sort of decide which one should be the most important. I guess my sort of, usually I try and decide whichever one has the closest relationship to the mainstream. So I guess I've been focusing mostly these days on white nationalists, young white nationalists, who have a group called like America First, and they're preppy, and they have sort of rebranded as Christian nationalists, and Christian nationalists now has this like sort of very large sort of umbrella that's brought in, elected officials who are like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are proudly identifying themselves as such, and then you have sort of fringe militants who are using the language of Christian nationalism to whitewash themselves and claim legitimacy. So that's sort of how I try and decide where to go, with sort of which direction to go in. But when I started this, it was just me at Vice, and now we have a whole team of us. So we can sort of also divide and conquer, as it were.
But it is really a challenge that I think in journalism schools and newsrooms, you have to have these discussions about, you have to present the threat, you have to understand the context and the danger and the violence, but at the same time, you don't want to give them a platform to present their ideology. So I think there is a real challenge, and especially
it's a really fine line.
It's a very fine line because we can't ignore it. We have to understand how dangerous it is, but we don't want to give them these platforms, and that's just to add on why we don't name the perpetrators in many of our films, because we don't want to draw attention to them.
Right, but I like what you say, Tess, especially as you were mentioning how early on you were kind of looking at the more mainstreamed, like supposedly, respectable anti-immigration groups, the ones that are very heavily funded, like FAIR, and there's plenty others in any kind of white supremacist landscape. You can find similar ones, like what is really Turning Point USA, right? And so, and how these organizations intersect with the more street thugs, right? So I imagine people get angry at you in your reporting, and you've probably received some unfriendly messages and maybe emails and maybe even packages to your home. I don't know.
No
Oh,
packages.
that's good.
No, I'm very,
that's
very
good.
careful with.
There was quite a disturbing event in August where you were covering CPAC, which is the Conservative Political Action Conference, and the latest troll, maybe he's not the latest troll, but Alex Stein, who has been making his name trolling mainly women and notorious for being particularly grotesque with AOC, went after you on camera. Can you explain what your strategy is when that happens and how you got out of that situation?
So it was actually my first time at CPAC, and I was sort of joking with my editors, it's not really a good sign when your extremism reporter is going to a political conference. But I wanted to go there and see kind of what sort of fringe elements, like, I was interested in Christian nationalism and seeing what kind of messaging was going to be with that, and it happened actually. A similar situation that was put on video, it happened the day before as well, where I sort of got swarmed by people, and sort of who recognized that I was a journalist. They saw my media tag, and it was a sort of like got mobbed essentially, and people would be filming, and there wasn't really anyone to sort of go to. And then the day after, it happened with this guy Alex Stein, who when we first started doing this reporting, a lot of the trolls, he has hundreds of thousands of followers, and he has dinner with Marjorie Taylor Greene. These trolls have massive platforms, and so he accosted me and was following me around, and this sort of drew this mob around me. This flashpoint, I guess. Well, I was wearing a mask.
Which is a sign that you're like somehow the enemy.
Exactly, and I knew that the mask was going to be a flashpoint. I frankly, I was getting married 2 weeks afterwards. I wouldn't have worn it otherwise, and I knew it was going to be an issue. We'd been warned by our security teams, but going into these situations, that masks will be flashpoints. But anyway, this video went very viral. He got a lot of kudos for it. Marjorie Taylor Greene retweeted it.
That's awful.
And I think that it definitely will set a playbook going forward for other reporters going to events like that, because whether people want to emulate Alex Stein, they know that they can go and make a video of harassing a reporter, and they will get a lot of retweets, a lot of likes, a lot of support for it. So that's definitely, I think, going to be a bit of a norm moving forwards.
Yeah, I think that one thing that journalists who are reporting out in the field need to be aware of is that right-wing extremists create their careers, build their careers around these moments of humiliation or moments of violence, and that in any kind of event where there's protest, counter-protests, they often end in some violence because that is the seller. Right, that gets the live stream going, that gets the viewers going, and so violence is a career maker, and humiliation is a career maker, and so to see, of course, someone like this in alignment and with support of a member of Congress is, super disturbing. But it is something that journalists have to be aware of, because in the past, if you went to cover one of these events, you didn't have the expectation that you were going to be filmed, but now you have to assume that you will be filmed, and you have to kind of act accordingly. And how do people act like that? What is your strategy if something like this?
When I was being mobbed, I think I just ignored it as best as I could, because I know that anything that you say, anything you say can be put into taken out of context, and so just to basically act like they're not even there. But I also, anytime I do interviews with an extremist, now even anytime I actually contact someone for comment, oftentimes I'll screenshot my email and put it on their channels. Anytime I speak to an extremist, I always assume that they're recording me somehow, and so there's no, you always have to be just as sort of direct and simple as you possibly can be.
So, and this is for everyone on the panel. I think that there's certain things that journalists are starting to get right, that we're starting to learn not to amplify the haters, the killers, by giving them platforms that are, unmediated. But we were really slow to this. And I think we've been very slow to even using language that the major political party in this country is now a party dedicated to really overturning democracy. And so why did it take so long for journalists to sort of understand this? Or you maybe have understood this for a while. Any thoughts? How we can be better?
Well, I think part of it is that fear and violence sell. That's how the system works. That's how people make money. And I think there are people who want to take great advantage of that, and they are. They are doing it. And I think some of the things that you're trying to think about in your reporting are incredibly important. I would also say that for us, if we continue to only, and I'm not, this is in any way a critique of your reporting, we need you, absolutely. But if we continue to only tell the story and sound the alarm about how horrible things are, and don't talk about what we can do, it will only get worse, because people will go into their homes and they will hide, and they will not leverage their own power because they don't see a way for them to participate, right? To be participants. And it just stokes the fear and creates the cycle that they want to create. They want to use these violent acts to suppress us. And I've seen it happen over and over again. When Stormfront started doxing, Richard Spencer lived in Whitefish, Montana, and his mother sort of called out a group, and the rabbi and some key leaders in the Jewish community suddenly were doxxed and threatened. And then Stormfront threatened to go to this small town in Montana, Whitefish, and have a march through the town. And that story, I mean, a lot of us around the country really tried to work at the response on that. But that could have been a turning point. I remember sitting there weeping to my husband when this happened, because it was right after the election. And it was like, this is how they're going to do it. This is how they're going to do it. They are going to create so much fear. And I think when we look at what's happening in towns now with this, we're not going to let our libraries cover any of these things. We're not going to let our kids understand history. This is happening right now. And like, there is an atmosphere, as you saw in the movie, that can keep going if we don't speak up. But if we only amplify that fear part and not what people are doing about it, and look for those stories. I mean, that's what we do with our work. It's not easy. I mean, it's really easy to find hate crimes, stories about hate crimes. They happen every single day, unfortunately, about at least a reported one every hour. It is, where is that story that says, there's an opening here. There's something we can do about it. And, you know, finding that possibility as well.
Yeah, it's about also training editors that these stories, which may not seem sexy or interesting, are actually super, super important, and people want to read about it. Like, Tessa, I remember me and you saw each other at the Unite the Right 2 rally in DC, which was supposedly the right's attempt to, replay Charlottesville, and it was a complete flop. And reporting on that flop was very important. And it was a flop because thousands of people in DC turned out and basically said, we don't want you here, right? And so I think that reporting on the weaknesses, right, and seeing those moments when the right attempts something and they fail are very important stories. And I feel that journalists have to take a side in this. We can't be neutral parties in, a war between white supremacist, anti-democratic forces. This is not a kind of, I like this color and I don't like this color thing. This is not a two sides issue anymore.
I agree, and I also think, to your point, Patrice, I think because extremism is, people like to read about extremists, because it's extreme. And I think unscrupulous editors will sort of want to feed the beast and want you have to sort of crank out stories that aren't necessarily serving a purpose. They're not actually, you're not actually getting to the heart of the issue. You're not finding out, just reporting, but you find out that a neo-Nazi group is putting flyers somewhere. That doesn't really cut the mustard for it. It's like, is there a police department that's sort of ignoring them, or like, is there a platform that they're organizing on where they're just sort of flagrantly disobeying their content policies? Like, there always has to be something else to it than just the existence of the group alone, in my view, for reporting on those stories. And then also, yes, reporting on their failures is huge. And we can see how our stories are responded to. Because I lurk in all of their chat rooms, and you can see how they sort of will deal with a story in real time. Can they spin it in any way, shape, or form? And that's, to be honest, that's also been incredibly sort of educational for me to see. Because there have been stories I've written where they are happy about it, and that's not what you want. So yeah.
So we're going to get to questions in 1 minute, but I just want to ask, Patrice, you just came back from Pittsburgh, and Pennsylvania has a real choice in this election, right? They have a full-on Christian fascist running for governor, and Doug Mastriano, and an election denier, and they have Josh Shapiro running against him. And so you were at a conference, an Eradicating Hate conference. Can you tell us a little bit about what people were talking about and what was urgent in this conference?
So it was, in the film, at the end, you see the formation of this Eradicate Hate Global Summit. There are some leaders, former president of the University of Pittsburgh and a lawyer from Jones Day, really interesting, decided to bring experts from around the world to talk about hate and seeking solutions to hate. It was very ambitious. I went last year. It was phenomenal. They doubled the number of experts and people around the world. Sort of the agenda was, what are the solutions? How do we deal with this? And this year there were journalists there participating in the discussion and talking about the role that journalism plays and what we can do. I think there's a couple of things I would say about it. First of all, it's phenomenal, and there are at least 150 stories that could have come out of that conference. I'm not kidding. They were just stunning. And like, nobody was there except the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle. I'm not kidding. I was just flabbergasted. But one of the things that the experts are saying, who are studying this radicalization online, is that it is happening here and now, that the violence is being perpetrated mostly in social media. It is constant, of course, influenced by the mainstream, and this sort of sea of hate that exists is being targeted towards lone wolves online right here, right now. Their message to us was, it's not if the next attack's going to happen, it's when, and our community's prepared, and what do we do? And I guess I would say, are journalists prepared? Are we prepared? Not just to cover trauma, and I think we better get better at covering trauma, unfortunately. I mean, that's the reality. And we better get better at telling stories that give people an idea about what they can do at every level. This is an inflection moment. I know I've been, this is my job, it's my beat, it's been my beat for 25 years, and, maybe I've been sounding the alarm for a long time, but I mean, it's beyond ringing. It's beyond ringing. And I agree with you that as journalists, we have a role in this moment that is so absolutely crucial. And so I'm really excited that there's so many young journalists here with us tonight.
Yeah, so how about we open it up to questions? You can come up to the mic here, and please feel free.
Hi, Hi, I'm a student here. My name's Christina Roman. This is a question for everyone, especially when it comes to covering extremism and these attacks. It feels like some of the shock and surprise that this happens has worn off, right? Like you said, it's not if, it's when. What, as journalists, can we do to move beyond a reactionary type of response to those attacks and those moments into something that is a little bit more prepared for and active and forward-looking and expecting it, as opposed to it being this reactionary shock?
Well, I can jump in quickly and just say, I think it's really important to not see incidents as isolated incidents, and to start to see the patterns and the connection between the groups who are perpetrating the violence, and when they actually put things online, their threats, to take them seriously. But I do think that, gravestones were turned over at a Jewish cemetery, or there was a new set at college campus, or there was a swastika on somebody's locker. We've just, that's not front page news. In this climate, I think we really need to sort of pay attention to these. There are hate incidents, and then there are hate crimes, and there's these mass casualty attacks, and we have to pay attention to all of them. And I think it's really important as journalism students to try to figure out how to do that. And in fact, we interviewed a young reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette after the Tree of Life, and you didn't see this clip in the film, but it is there. She talks about how, before Tree of Life, there was a swastika, somebody hung a swastika flag across the street from an interracial couple, and we reported on it. And she said, and then there was a bar fight down the street from the newsroom, and then somebody went out and stabbed a black man on the street and killed him. And she said, we reported on it. But it was after Tree of Life, when this mass casualty attack happened, that she said they should have been looking at the patterns. Who are these people who are operating in our own communities? And to tell those stories. So that's one way to look at it.
I think it's also important to look at what is law enforcement's reaction, and that's been something, just as a photographer, it's been a revelation that in demonstration after demonstration after demonstration, its law enforcement does not arrest the white supremacists, they arrest the counter-protesters. And so who is our law enforcement? And where are our district attorneys on this? And how vigorously are they prosecuting? Because prosecution can work in some situations, right? I mean, prosecution and civil lawsuits, that's how the Aryan Nation was taken down in the 90s, by basically civil lawsuits, right?
Yeah, and I want to echo that and just go a little further. So every year the FBI reports maybe 8,000 hate crimes happen every year. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, another branch of the government, estimates there are about 250,000. And in that, there is incredible trauma. There are stories of people who refuse to report to law enforcement. We did a film called Light in the Darkness. It was about an Ecuadorian immigrant being murdered in this town, and the town grappling with the fact that it happened. High school students were involved in this attack and made it happen, and that they had been roaming the streets for months looking for Mexicans to beat up. Before that happened, there were so many incidents that were missed. Like, what are the stories that we are missing? As Charene just said, what are the stories where they're not getting to that are underreported and may even be incidents, not even crimes, like happened in Patchogue, that we are missing and not reporting on? And then what are people doing to stop it? How can we elevate that as well?
Ironically, in Patchogue, the reports from immigrants in the community, they were telling the librarians, because that became a hub where people could meet and talk about things, and the librarians were about to hold a town hall and invite law enforcement, but the librarians knew what was going on in the town before law enforcement knew about it and before it was too late.
But isn't that one reason why librarians are being targeted? Because it is a space that allows conversation where people are supposed to be able to feel free, and that these are spaces that are under attack, right? Public areas, just, parades, libraries, places of civic engagement are under attack. Tess, you were gonna say.
I was just going to say that I guess one of the things that it's been described to me as a feedback loop. And so when you get into a situation where you have a particular narrative targeting a group, which is, you have the same narrative from the fringes, I'm seeing it on 4chan or on Gab, the worst places on the internet, and you're also hearing the same thing on Tucker Carlson's show. That is a lot of people, that's a very, very large echo chamber. And so when you have a group that's being targeted, for example, whether it's transgender medical clinics, who are being targeted all the way across the board, or LGBTQ pride events, that's a very, very dangerous place to be in, I think.
Thanks. Thank you.
I also think you did a really good job in responding to this question in the movie, because the way you contextualize it is also a response that's not reactive, but putting it in context of the entire history of white supremacy, and I think that was super key, because you don't isolate one incident, you tie it all together.
Right, which is also what Dean Cobb was saying, is is that there is a history in the United States of this violence, a long history, and that these are not one-offs, right?
Hello, my name's Danny Mendez. I'm a full-time MS student. I'm here with my reporting class. I was wondering, one thing that was mentioned in the film was how you can see these things kind of coming up in, or maybe it was in the panel, but coming up in chat rooms or forums, or increasingly I'm seeing on Twitter hate speech. And in some way, it's like I feel like people need to understand how much this is bubbling to the surface. A poignant moment in the film I thought was the young girl saying that she thought that anti-Semitism was a relic of World War II. So is there a way to draw attention to the fact that people feel much more comfortable now publicly displaying hate speech without also amplifying the propaganda of the speech?
Well, in the first interview we did with the rabbi in Pittsburgh, first he said he was a victim, a survivor, a witness, and a rabbi, and he was very moving in that first meeting. But it was a few weeks before the midterm elections in 2018, and in that first interview, when he was still in shock and processing what happened to himself and his community, he talked about hate speech, and he said, these political leaders are engaging in hate speech. It has to stop. That was one of the key things he spoke about in that first interview. And he said, not just in the online sphere on Gab and 4chan and 8chan and these sites that traffic in this kind of hate speech, but he said hate speech led to a massacre in my synagogue. And he really wanted to amplify this dialogue around hate speech, which is why it plays so prominently in the film. And it was that interview with him 3 days after Donald Trump had come to Tree of Life to pay his respects. And there was an enormous counter-protest that day. 1,000 people showed up. They had banners, even Mr. Rogers wouldn't want you in this neighborhood, Mr. Trump. And it was, amazing. And they were peaceful, they sang songs, but they were protesting, and they were calling on Trump to fully denounce white nationalism. And that is a scene in the film that we didn't share. But, focusing on those kinds of stories, the dangers of hate speech, and as the Congresswoman said in the Homeland Security panel, words that lead to violence, which resonate throughout many of our films, and it's just something we all need to focus on.
I just want to say one thing, and there's a new book that's coming out that I think all of us need to read, especially journalists. It's Lee Bollinger and Jeffrey Stone are the editors. It's a series of essays called Social Media, Freedom of Speech, and the Future of Democracy. And it is a really sort of breaking open the conversation about how we see freedom of speech. And I think there are a lot of examples of how the hard right extremists are using freedom of speech as a way to have their way. And it's again, sounding the alarm with some really clear calls to action. So thank you for that question, for probing at that. It's a really important discussion.
I think also that there have been some victories, and so a recent one for people following this is, do people know what Kiwi Farms is? Yeah, so you can look it up rather than me try and, muddle my way through the definition, but it's basically an anti-LGBTQ hit squad, right? International hit squad. And people were fleeing for their lives, leaving their countries, hiding out. And a concerted effort by activists, then supported by journalists in major platforms like NBC News, ended up creating so much pressure that Cloudflare, the company that hosts the site, took them down. And so I think that should have been front page news, right? To show that this can happen. There is power that people have. One American News, right? It's no longer on cable, is it? Or at least a lot of cable channels. Wasn't it kicked off, I believe? Right? And so I think that these are stories that journalists need to pursue. How did that happen? How is this campaign going? Who are the leaders? What are you doing next, right? These kinds of questions.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anya Gruszczyńska. I'm also in the MS Doc program. So you spoke about what journalists are doing that are not good for the problem, which includes amplifying stories, not amplifying stories that should be told, including the failures of extremism rather than only their victories. I'm wondering whether there are some things that non-journalists, people do that they have good intentions in and think they're doing good, but actually are harming the anti-extremism movement.
Well, I wonder how you all feel about doxing. Doxing white supremacists, which is an anti-fascist tactic, right? Which gets people deplatformed, lose their jobs. I've often wondered, in the long run, is this positive? Is this negative?
I mean, I think it was enormously effective in the aftermath of Charlottesville, for example. But in Charlottesville, these guys were marching with their faces completely bare, and so it was like a field day for anti-fascist activists afterwards. They could just go through and, it was like a game almost. And they did an amazing job, frankly, and people really suffered the consequences of their actions that day. But since then, groups have learned from their mistakes. They've evolved. And so now when they go out to the streets, they cover their faces and they cover their tattoos. They make very hard to identify them. And so, anti-fascists, as a result, have had to sort of pivot their tactics because they can't, it's not just, they can't just sort of go through the kind of footage that they could do before.
But there are all these online groups. I mean, if you look at the January 6th criminal prosecutions, a lot of those prosecutions happened because of regular people investigating who was there. The sedition hunters, I think, is one group, capital hunters, and they're basically this sort of army of tipsters on who's out there, who's, committed violence on January 6th or were part of the insurrection. I wonder, though, in the long run, kind of what that means when you deplatform, when someone loses their job, like what then happens to that person? Do they all of a sudden feel like, oh, I want to re-enter the community as a nice individual? Probably not. They probably end up becoming more angry, more grieved, and so it feels like a win actually when someone is called out and doxxed, but I'm not sure the short-term strategy ends up being a positive long-term one.
Another interesting strategy that I guess I've seen anti-fascists use is the sort of disruption strategy, where they will infiltrate their chat groups or their private event planning groups, and basically just cause chaos, pose as one of their own and sort of cause infighting. And as a result, I've seen, I think there was a series of White Lives Matter marches planned for this year or last year, it's a blur. But they basically successfully infiltrated this entire network, and the entire movement just collapsed in on itself.
Yeah, that was impressive.
Yeah.
And those kinds of actions, I think, are very impressive, because it's designed to create mistrust within their own community and also give a sense that they were not as capable as they seem. I think that also the Patriot Front Group has been victim of that, of people sort of infiltrating. So, and these are really good stories, of course, for journalists. It's like, how did that happen? How do you mobilize to do that? They're hard stories to get because anti-fascists doing this work don't want to talk.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you all for speaking here tonight. My name is Nathan Siegelaub. My question is for the two filmmakers. I was wondering why this subject material worked on film. Why wasn't this a photo essay? Why wasn't this a feature piece? What about the medium appealed to you both? And what were the challenges in bringing it to the screen?
I think any good piece of journalism will make you care about the story, and this story certainly lended itself to film. We need to see and hear and, like, in our minds, build relationships with the people who were harmed. We need to see people like ourselves in this story, and sort of seeing them, hearing them in context is really important. I think an interesting point about this film that's, our films are about collective action. They are about what people do together. And a lot of that was shut down when the pandemic happened, right? So people were moving. In Pittsburgh, they were moving together. There was this momentum, right? And then when the pandemic happened, it stopped. And so how do you tell a story about that? I mean, we managed to do it. Partly, we only have one scene of a Zoom story, but I think if you see it, it's about place. It makes you feel about place. It I think helps you build relationships with the characters in a way that you can't necessarily do in other mediums. And so I guess I'm a filmmaker too, so I'm a little prejudiced.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Annika. I'm also an MS student here. And I was wondering, you touched a bit about on the issue of echo chambers and also of white ring extremism moving towards the mainstream. And you see mainstream outlets like Fox News being so strikingly similar in their immigration coverage to alternative outlets like Breitbart. So how should we as journalists position ourselves to that issue, and how can we maybe counteract that development of the mainstream being more oriented towards the right?
I think one of the biggest challenges, at least, is the use of sort of language and tropes, how sort of ideas or dog whistles are kind of smuggled into the mainstream, and these sort of different codes are sent to the mainstream. And so as the journalist trying to sort of pick them apart, whether it's something, a mention of George Soros standing in as a sort of anti-Semitic dog whistle, or talking about the grooming, about grooming fears and using that as a way to sort of traffic in anti-LGBTQ bigotry. So basically just being really, I think, attuned to the words that you're hearing and what they're actually stand-ins for, and not being afraid to sort of call it out for what it is, if that makes sense.
It's in your film. I mean, it's noted that the killer was saying, I like that the wording is now gone from illegal to invader, right? Mm-hmm. And so what that means is that for you who are reporting on, say, immigration, your use of language and how you frame your characters, right, to make people, your subject completely whole, right? They're not simply just, migrants, right? Like they are people with names and people with histories and people, with dreams and visions for life, right? And I think that's one way to counter it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Devadrita and I'm also a student here at Columbia, and I'm from India, and in India we see extremism of some other form, and there's also censorship out there. Many films and books are also censored, and right now in the US, I think there was this article that said that there's a rapid acceleration of censorship currently in the country. So as journalists, how do we kind of counter that? What advice do you have for us?
I was just going to give you an anecdote from the film we made in Patchogue after 7 high school students killed Marcelo Lucero, who was an immigrant from Ecuador. Somewhere towards the end of the film, Marcelo's brother, Yosello, comes to town. He spends years in town. There's a trial. There's a murder trial. The 7 high school students are charged and tried, and it's a very, involved story. But Yosello, he creates connections in this town. He starts meeting people, and he spends time there. And at the end of the film, there's a group of quilters. Patrice filmed this scene. These women in the town make a quilt with Marcelo Lucero's face, and they present it to Yosello. This was after the conviction. And Yosello stands up in the library, and he says, "Did my brother really have to die for us to get to know each other?" And I think, in terms of reporting, it's the stories that we share of the people who live in our towns and our communities, and making sure that we tell them so that we can help people get to know each other in some way.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Scott. I'm an alumnus from Columbia, from the math department. My main, for a long time, my main news source was sort of progressive online programming like the Young Turks. And at a certain point, I just canceled my subscription because it's just like, if you want to, it's just unending clips of like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Gomert, and all these guys, and then they are saying these horrendous things, and then the TYT guys like make like disparaging remarks about them, or then that's like interspersed with like stories about police beatings, stories about police killings, and I was just wondering, why, and some of the things you guys were saying too seem sort of you're playing on the defense. Like I was always wondering, like, I know like the International Rescue Commission, they have an office in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where like the best pizza restaurant in the world is like in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And they have this program of like, citizens inviting refugees over for dinner. So I was like, well, why don't they have a reality TV show about that? Of like this guy from the world's best pizza place who's been there forever, uses his incredible social network to get, and the IRC office is right there, and they just connect and do like little shows about like these families, inviting them in and helping them out, like, or why don't they have, like, I have this crazy idea, like you could get Medicare for all very quickly if you added veterinary coverage. Because even like right-wing nutcases love their pets, So, so like, you could have this. You could have, instead of TYT just doing this endless thing, why don't they have a reality show called Medicare for All plus veterinary, and then you could even pick out these right-wing guys and their dog's about to die because they can't afford the veterinary costs, and you just find funding for them to save their pet's life or something, like stuff like that.
I mean, I think that one, I would watch the show. I don't know if I'd watch the one about the Medicare for All, but I'd watch the one with the pizza place for sure, and refugees. But I think that there is a point that you're making, is that somehow popular culture has not kept up the pace in terms of providing us with the stories and the shows that we need now. Like, I grew up watching Archie Bunker, All in the Family. For people who grew up in the analog days, they might remember it was a story about an American bigot and his children, in Queens, right, and his children who made fun of him. And it was a super popular show. And Norman Lear, the producer of a lot of American TV in the 70s, had show after show that helped develop a progressive liberal culture in the United States. And our culture instead now, if you look at television shows, it's like Survivor, reality TV, all about consumption. But it wasn't always like that. So I do think that as journalists go out there, also report on what is popular culture doing to help enable or disable extremism. And I think that's a fair beat.
I'll say on that note, I've just started watching The Boys, which actually is an amazing critique of like the personal of extremism.
What's it
basically.
called?
The Boys. It's like a superhero show, which is not normally my bag, but it's actually, I think, like brilliant. They obviously really know what they're talking about. So
good to know.
Recommend it.
I think we're going to have to end it here, and I would just love to give a round of applause for our great guests. Thank you so much for coming out, and please follow Tess Owen on Vice, and Patrice O'Neill, and Charene Zalis.
NIOT.org.
Thank you very much.